Hello everyone, welcome to the Missouri Teacher Development System Artisan Teacher On-Demand video series. I'm Mike Rutherford, happy to be your host and facilitator for this series of learning experiences. Today we're going to talk about giving and receiving feedback. One of the things we know about effective teaching is we just get better and better and better at our craft if we not only practice it and give ourselves feedback, which could be called reflection. We get better and better at a faster rate if we invite other sets of eyes and other minds into our classrooms to give us feedback as well. We're going to have two sections to this. The first is some ideas for how to provide feedback to other professionals in an effective and safe way. And then we're going to have a second episode on some tips and ideas for how to be a really good receiver of feedback. What to do when you're the person on the receiving end of feedback and how you might maximize that. Now, the way we'll do it is we're going to work first on just a little piece that I'd like to call fundamentals of feedback. We're going to look at 4 fundamentals of feedback that both providers and receivers of feedback do well to master. And then we'll break it up and we'll have a section just for providing feedback, and then we'll have another section just for receiving feedback. Thanks for being a part. So let's get started with these 4 fundamentals of feedback. And the first fundamental is just what I like to call the logic model for feedback. I mean, why give feedback? Why invite people to give you feedback? Why is feedback such an important part of what mentors and instructional coaches and administrators and colleagues do? It turns out there's a lot of logic behind the notion of why to give feedback. I've drawn a little picture of it. Let's go look, and I'll use the illustration to sort of talk us through the logic behind why providing and receiving feedback makes good sense for us as educators. So what we want to have in the center of the model is skillful teaching. It takes knowledge to teach, it takes skill to teach, it takes a good attitude and a set of values to teach. What we're focusing on right now, though, is the skillfulness of teaching, right? One of the things that we know is that it is actually the teacher's skill set. What can the teacher do? How flexible is he or she? How many different effective tools do they have in their toolbox that really drive student success? So in our logic, we know that skillful teaching is the prime mover of student success. It's not the only mover. It's not the only thing that causes students to be successful. There's more to the recipe for students being unusually successful in a classroom than just the skillfulness of a teacher. We do know this, however, the skillfulness of the teacher is the highest durable effect size variable of all the variables that impact student success. So here's the logic. Skillful teaching is the prime mover of student success. So what is the mover of skillful teaching? How does one get more skillful as a teacher? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We get more effective through practice. Since teaching is predominantly a skill set, how do you develop a skill set? How do you learn to play the piano? How do you learn to ride a skateboard? How do you learn to surf, right? You don't just watch a video on it. You don't just go to graduate school and study it. You have to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. You have to actually practice it. So here we go. Skillful teaching drives student success. Practice drives skillful teaching. Now, let's talk about feedback. It turns out there are 2 types of practice: without feedback and with feedback. And let's just contrast those 2. We know that teachers can improve and can become awesome and exceptional without any feedback. If they have no mentors and they have no colleagues and the administrators in their building hang out in the office all day, well, guess what? Teachers can still improve their craft. They can still get more and more skillful. And the reason for that is because of practice. If you are a reflective practitioner, which just means you think on a regular basis about what you're doing, do the things that work more often, do the things that don't work so well less often. That's called reflective practice. So a teacher can improve his or her skillfulness just through being reflective. However, there's a limit to reflection. And the limit is that no matter how much we reflect on our own practice, we're reflecting on it with the same brain, ours, that formulated the lesson to begin with. So we're always seeing our teaching through the filter of, well, the person who was the teacher in that episode. And that's valuable, but it does leave out quite a bit of possible learning. So we know that while teachers can get better without feedback if they're reflective enough, we think that teachers can get better faster with feedback. Positive, frequent, timely, specific, growth-evoking feedback, follow the arrow, we think generates about a 5-to-2 growth ratio in comparison to without feedback. So what does feedback do? In essence, feedback accelerates growth at about 2.5 to 1, and that's a pretty big number, isn't it? Think about it. A teacher can improve his or her craft 2.5 times faster if they get quality feedback and combine that with their reflective practice that they have already. That turns out to be a pretty big number, and of course that comes right back to students being successful. So feedback accelerates growth. That's the logic model for why it's important to be an effective provider and an effective receiver of feedback. Okay, so 4 fundamentals for providing and receiving feedback. The first fundamental is the logic model behind it, right? We know that teachers can grow faster with feedback than without feedback. Number 2, the second fundamental of feedback is to understand that having another person in our classrooms watching us as we teach and then taking the time to talk to us about what they think and what they saw turns out to be feedback that we just can't provide for ourselves. I like to think of it this way. The second fundamental of providing and receiving feedback is to remember this. We see with our minds, not with our eyes. Now, of course we see with our eyes too, but the eyes are just a sensory organ, right? They take light. It impacts the optic nerve. It gets processed into your primary visual cortex. But it's our brain that makes sense of these images that are coming in through our eyes. So sometimes we think that if I were to give myself feedback from another angle, or if I were to put a video camera in my room so that I can see things from another angle, now that would be effective. That's actually a pretty good idea. But notice that we're just changing the optical angle. We're not really changing the cognitive angle because it's the same person that's interpreting this incoming visual information. Have you ever been to a meeting with a friend, and after the meeting was over and you debriefed it, you kind of talked about it, it kind of felt like you and your friend went to 2 different meetings? Has that ever happened? They were remembering things that you didn't remember. You were pointing out items that seemed to go right past them. You did both technically go to the same meeting, but since you attended that meeting with 2 different minds, you had 2 different experiences. Get in a car with a friend, a family member, and drive down the road for 20 or 30 minutes. And even though you're sitting, 2.5 feet apart, looking out the same windshield of your car, you're actually having 2 different trips. Because even though you're seeing the same things optically, your brain is processing those images differently than the person sitting next to you. Why is that? Well, you've had a completely different life. You've had a completely different set of experiences. You may have grown up in a different state. You might be a different age. You might be a different gender. You've had a completely different set of life's experiences. So that's why when we're driving down the road, we're all seeing the same thing, but my friend and I are probably taking 2 separate trips, right? My friend probably didn't even notice that we just drove past a DQ Grill and Chill, which has unbelievable Heath Bar blizzards. If you've never had a Heath Bar blizzard, then you don't know why you ought to pay attention to where there's a Dairy Queen on your trip. I'll bet the person I was riding with didn't even see the Dairy Queen. I did. Why is that? Because I've had a life full of experiences with Heath bar blizzards. That's why the second fundamental is to remember we see with our minds, not just with our eyes. So when we invite another person to come into our classroom and watch our craft and talk to us and give us feedback, it's not just that we have another set of eyes in the classroom. That's not what's really causing that experience to be so valuable. It's that we have another brain in the classroom with another set of complete life's experiences that can then spot things that maybe we might miss. Fundamental number 2, remember, is that we see with our minds, not with our eyes. Four fundamentals of providing and receiving feedback. Fundamental number 3 is take a strengths-based approach to providing and receiving feedback. There are basically 2 ways to improve our craft as teachers. One is called the strengths-based approach, and as the name implies, that's where we basically try to spot one another's talents and their abilities and their gifts, right? And the things that they have high capacity for, the things where they have a little virtuosity. And then the other way to get better as a teacher is to invite people to take a look at our weaknesses, to take a look at what we're doing wrong, to take a look at where we're missing opportunities, to take a look at where we're making mistakes. Now, since life is short and no one has extra time at work, we know that both providing and receiving feedback is much more productive when it's strengths-based, as opposed to being weakness-based. So even though, as I'm providing feedback for you, if you were to invite me into your classroom as a colleague, as a mentor, I might see some things that you could do differently. But really my value to you is more than that. It's where can I spot some things that are strengths for you, where you have some giveaways, right, of how exactly you're strong in that area. I might learn to watch for where you're really fast, because speed is a true indicator of a strength. I might look for areas where you make it look easy, right? I know you're doing something difficult, but you're just doing it so fluidly and you don't seem to be struggling with it. That's bound to be a strength of yours. I might look for things that you do on a repeated basis that recur for you. We always take our strengths and use them more often than our weaknesses. It just makes good common sense, doesn't it? And then I also might pay close attention to when the classroom throws you a curveball, when things go a little unexpected in your classroom, and watch how you respond to that. We tend to always respond to unexpected events in the classroom. Maybe the technology breaks down, or maybe there's a little issue among a couple of students, something that disrupts the flow. When something disrupts the flow, we almost always turn to a strength to get it back. If your strength is that you're really organized, you organize your way out of a fix. If your strength is that you have great relationship building skills, then you relationship your way out of a pickle, right? So watching how we respond to these things can be really good indicators as to what our strengths are. Now, don't get me wrong. Feedback that points out errors and that points out areas in my craft where I'm underperforming, we're professionals and we ought to be able to handle that. As a rule though, let's remember that whether we're providing feedback or whether we're receiving it, there's more room for growth and development in the area of a teacher's abilities and his or her capacities, their talents, their strengths. There's just more room to grow there than there is in the areas of where we make a mistake or where we could have done something differently or where we maybe left some money on the table, so to speak. There's more room for improvement in strength than there is in weakness. So fundamental number 3 for providers and receivers is to, whenever possible, take a strengths-based approach. By the way, I think that's actually a higher level thinking skill. It's more productive, yes, but it's also more difficult to walk into another teacher's classroom and to spot strengths and abilities than it is to spot errors and weaknesses. It's just not that hard to spot mistakes and to spot weaknesses. In fact, I think probably I could take a reasonably educated parent out of the carpool line at your school and we could go into any teacher's classroom and we could probably spot some errors and we could spot some areas where improvement is needed. It's just not that hard to do. What really is productive and what really is a skill worth building is our ability in ourselves and others to spot opportunities for big leaps of growth. And those opportunities almost always come in the area of our strengths and our capacities and our abilities. So we're working on 4 fundamentals of providing and receiving feedback. The 4th fundamental I'd like to share with you, I've just given it a bit of a name. It's called one brain, 2 jobs. One brain, 2 jobs means that teachers, well, each teacher has one brain. But that brain of that teacher, right? So let's get our brain model out. The teacher's brain, my brain, if you're in my classroom giving me feedback, your brain, if I'm in your classroom observing and giving you feedback, gosh, is a marvelous organ, an amazing feat. You know, it's the seat of all the knowledge in the universe packed into this. It's just amazing. But it is just one brain. And the brain, even though it's an oversimplification, has 2 jobs with respect to giving and receiving feedback. And the 2 jobs are, number 1, protection, and number 2, learning. Notice that job 1 is protection. Job 2 is learning. So let's say you're a provider of feedback. Instead of using the brain, let me just use a quick drawing that I made. So here's me or you, right? We're teachers. It's a good idea to remember that as a teacher, I have one brain, but that brain has 2 jobs. The first job of the brain, honestly, is to protect me in my personal and professional life. Protect me from what? Protect me from who? Well, from you and from feedback that might, mess with my psyche, or that might feel critical, or that might sound judgmental. It's just a good idea to remember, if you're a provider of feedback, this teacher that you're providing feedback to has an amazing brain, but the first job of that brain is to protect the teacher. So if we come on too strong, if we're critical, if we're judgmental, if we don't explain exactly why we're doing what we're doing and why we're saying what we're saying, the teacher's brain will default to that first job and will build a wall that the teacher's brain will defend the teacher, right, from feedback. If you're giving me feedback on my teaching and it's not very skillfully given, and it feels critical and it feels judgmental, and you're kind of putting yourself in a I know better than you situation, then even though you're giving me some amazing feedback, my brain is building a wall as we speak to protect me from the threat. So the second job of the brain is to learn. And so as a provider of feedback, then, number 1, remember, I don't want to activate the primary job of the teacher's brain. I don't want to come across as being critical and judgmental and meddling. I want to come across as being supportive and curious and excited and enthusiastic about being in the teacher's classroom. If we want to get to job 2, which is I want to learn from the feedback that's being provided to me, I've got to get my brain refocused from job 1, which is to protect me. Now, this isn't something that happens with teachers who are, less than effective. This isn't a defect in the way our brain works. Our brain has been developing over thousands and thousands of years to be the amazing organ that it is. And so it has these two jobs. Now, let's just switch the roles for a moment and think a little bit about being the receiver of feedback. It's a really good idea that when I'm receiving feedback from you, let's say, I keep in mind that my brain has two jobs. And if I'm aware that its first job is protection, and I say to myself, if I focus too much on protection, I'm going to miss the opportunity to learn. So this goes both ways. If you're a provider of feedback, what do you keep in mind? One brain, two jobs. If you're a receiver of feedback, what do you keep in mind? One brain, two jobs. Those are four fundamentals of feedback, providing feedback and receiving feedback. Now, what we're going to do in our next segment is we're going to differentiate. And we'll have one video experience that now focuses on the applications of keeping those fundamentals in mind. What are some extra effective ways to provide growth-evoking feedback? And then we'll have another segment that will focus on the receiving of feedback. And we'll do the same thing. With these four fundamentals in mind, what would be some extra sharp applications to make to my own craft when I'm in the role of receiving feedback from someone else? Hey, thanks a lot again for being a part of the Missouri Teacher Development System Artisan Teacher On-Demand Learning Series. Thanks for your great participation today, and we'll see you in the next episode. So now let's focus our attention on providing growth-evoking feedback to other teacher professionals. We've taken a look at four fundamentals that apply to both providing feedback and receiving feedback. Now let's focus on the provision of effective growth-evoking feedback to teachers. So this is when you're in the role of a mentor, you're in the role of a veteran teacher, a colleague, an instructional coach, an administrator, anyone really who has as a part of their job description the care and development of teachers and teaching in your building. Based on the four fundamentals, let's look at some success principles for providing teachers with effective growth-evoking feedback. And we'll take a look at five success principles. Success principle number one: enter the classroom as a visitor, not an owner. Remember that whenever someone observes us, whether it's a virtual classroom or whether it's a real face-to-face classroom, it's a little bit of a scary experience, right? We know we're all professionals. We know we have an open door. We know it's important to have people watch us teach. Still, when another person enters a teacher's classroom, especially if that person is experienced or has a reputation of being a really effective teacher, or maybe you're a mentor of other teachers, there's a little bit of anxiety there. So it's a good idea to enter the classroom from the perspective of a visitor. You're really kind of on sacred ground here. So metaphorically, let's take our shoes off. Let's be kind and gentle. Let's not come into anyone's classroom with the idea that I'm here from the government to check and see how you're doing with your students. Rather, I'm here because I'm a supporter. I'm here because I'm a co-professional. I'm a colleague. I'm curious. And I expect that we're going to have a really positive experience as we trade feedback back and forth. In almost every teacher's physical classroom, there's a place where the teacher may have a desk, may have some photos of his or her family. They might keep their lunch or occasionally pay a bill or write a letter. It's a good idea. I think it's a professional protocol to mostly stay away from those areas. Teacher desk areas are becoming smaller and smaller, and many teachers don't even have a desk in their classroom anymore. Still, even if there's no desk, there probably is a personal area. It's a good idea to leave that area alone. Of all the places we can go, just sort of consider that as being a little bit off limits. Remember, we're entering that classroom as an invited guest, not as an entitled owner. It's a good idea to make contact with the teacher when we come in. Teachers are busy. Still, if you could make eye contact, if you could just either voice or just mute a little, thankful to be in your classroom, thanks for having me in for a moment today. Once we've made some sort of contact with the teacher, that tends to put the teacher a little more at ease. Also a good idea to make a little bit of contact before you exit the classroom. Really enjoyed today. Lots of great things going on in your classroom. Rather than just packing up and leaving, remember this, that in the mind of the teacher, no information is interpreted as negative information. You know, the human brain is a survival organ, and so it considers worst case scenario. Wow, I didn't even make eye contact with my mentor when he or she came into my classroom today. They didn't say anything. We didn't have any conversation. The human brain, as a defense mechanism, will often spin that into, well, then what must have gone wrong? And then here I am, I probably are going to spend minutes, maybe even hours of anxiety that's basically needless. Principle number one, enter as a guest, enter as a visitor, not as an owner. Success principle number two, make your feedback timely. There's hardly any other aspect of working with teachers where this is more important. I'd like to suggest that timely means two things. Number one, it means frequently. It's better to have lots of touches of brief feedback than just a few longer observations where the feedback is, voluminous. If you can get into teachers' classrooms on a regular basis so that the observations are short and the feedback is short, and then I can get used to you coming. So frequent. The other understanding of timely feedback is that the feedback should be immediate after the observation. If you visited my classroom for a few minutes on Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, try to get some feedback back to me. If not immediately, then within the next few minutes, at least by the middle of that day. Delayed feedback is not worthless, but delayed feedback is worth less. And besides that, it creates unneeded anxiety as well. So success principle number two is that really effective feedback is timely. And timely has two meanings. Number one, frequently, and number two, immediately. Great. Success principle number three. Observe what we call both field and ground. When you come into a teacher's classroom to do a quick feedback observation, try to see the big picture, that's what we call field, and then try to see some of the individual details, that's what we call ground. Great observers are always cycling back and forth between field and ground. Big picture, details. Big picture, details. Everything, just one thing. Entire classroom, just this one segment of what's going on. Amateur classroom observers tend to always observe whatever's going on about 8 feet in front of them. You know, just for reference, 8 feet, right? So let's see, how far is 8 feet? Here's what we just said. Novice classroom observers observe usually from a focal length, there it is, of about 8 feet. It's just what comes naturally to us. We don't want to get too close. We don't want to interrupt the action at a table or with students. And we don't want to get too far away so that we miss some of the action. Actually, 8 feet is too far away to see anything up close, and it's too close to see anything systemic or big picture in the classroom. So remember, one of the principles of effective classroom feedback is to observe big picture from far away, put your back against the wall, try to capture the gestalt of the entire classroom, and then go to ground. Go to something really up close and observe something in fine detail. 2 or 3 trips between field and ground will reveal much more information than just 8 or 10 or 12 minutes spent at 8 feet away from what it is we're observing. Success principle number 4, feedback should be specific. When we offer feedback to teachers, general feedback